Hi everyone, my name's Anne Van Loon. I work for Baptist Care SA in their church support team. I'd like to welcome you to Be Care, which is a short course for individual Christians, for small groups, for ministry teams, on how we can respond to contemporary needs and challenges and concerns in our community with compassion so that we can promote well-being, belonging and health. The lesson that we're going to be looking at this time is how to be care. And the particular topic we're going to look at is how we can be care in times of crisis and respond well to people at the time of great need. So, what constitutes a crisis? Some years ago, I took my children to a theme park on the Gold Coast, and this photo was taken. It's very blurry, but you can see that our daughter was enjoying the situation on the roller coaster. Our son was trying to enjoy the situation. Behind him sat his parents. My husband looked like he was wondering whether his insurance was going to cover the experience, and I thought, what am I doing here? Is family bonding really worth it? Same situation, but it induced various responses in each member of our family. The second time round, our daughter went and her hands were up in the air. She was thrilling to the situation. Our son was still a little uncertain, but trying to relax more in it and cope with the situation, but prepared to give it another go. Our youngest son, completely terrified by the experience and really didn't want to go anywhere near it again. And myself, I didn't even want to go for a second run. So the same situation, the same family, varied responses. And this is also true for crisis. Crisis can have different responses in the same family members, and so between people in a culture and between communities, you will find different responses to crisis. And so, as far as pastoral care goes, we have to be flexible in our responses. Serious crisis is, in fact, when there is potential risk to life or a person can't cope without on-the-spot assistance. We can think of things like death in the family or sudden illness or accidents or emergencies. Those sorts of things are crisis situations. But interpersonal crises are just as real and just as difficult, and they require discernment. So we have to be prepared to pray and be prepared to be slow and careful and discern what is needed rather than think we have the answers to this any situation. They can cause many needs and they can cause many challenges to a person's sense of self, their sense of identity. And therefore, interpersonal and intrapersonal crises can be very challenging for good pastoral care. However, out of crises, the very word means turning point. There can be turning points for good, and positive and good things can come from crises. But crises can also bring times of great suffering, and God doesn't want us to suffer. He can use suffering for our good, but He doesn't want us to suffering. There are several scripture passages in this, and I won't read them all, but patient endurance can lead to holiness. And we read in James 1 verse 2 to 4, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing." So we can see that we can become holier through the experience. It can lead us to a better and stronger reliance on God. Equally, I have seen crises that also turns people away from God, and so our responses need to be very careful. In Psalm 119 verse 67 we read, "Before I was afflicted I went astray, but now I obey your word." We can understand sometimes suffering pulls us back to rely on God, to understand His word, to go back to His promises, and to deepen and lean in to our faith. It can be of service to other people, which means that we can have experiences that other people can learn from or that grow the church. And Paul writes in his letters to the Ephesians in chapter 3 verse 13, I ask you, therefore, not to be discouraged because of my suffering for you, which are your glory. So for Paul went into prison for the well-being of others, and so that the crisis situation can sometimes work for good, and we need to understand that. We also know that it can strengthen our faith, and the whole book of Job is about suffering and the crises that Job experienced one after the other. We can learn a lot from, because what we do learn from Job is that there was many of his friends who came and gave him the kind of advice which was not helpful, the sorts of advice that said, you know, you must have done something really wrong, Job, or your children must have done something wrong, or you better ask for forgiveness, and all these kinds of things that were dependent on Job. And really what God was saying was, lean into me, Job, and the rest will be okay. And God's work can be revealed in suffering. We read that in John 9, and it's in verses 1 to 3. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, that this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. So good things can come. It doesn't necessarily come from our sin. Our crises are not necessarily our own fault. Our crises can be experienced through other people in our family, through the decisions of leaders of countries when they send them to war. Many things can bring about these changes in our lives that create huge crises. And we know that in Job 33, the turning point for Job came when he said, he may speak in their ears and terrify them with warnings, to turn people from wrongdoing and keep them from pride, to preserve their souls from the pit, their life from perishing by the sword. So you can see that God can use these things for good, and he can use them for good in our lives as well. But that doesn't mean that that's what he wants. And what he wants is for us to lean into him and to rely on him. And that is exactly what the book of Job shows us. Job leaned into God, continued to worship God in the midst of great loss and great suffering, to find peace and wholeness. Suffering does impact the whole person, and we need to come to terms with the question of why does God allow suffering. And this session is not going to be focusing on any of that, because it's a much bigger topic than we have time for. This is just a really brief introduction to the support that we can give during crisis. So the most important thing for us to know is to take some time to think, why does God allow suffering? Because we will be asked that question a lot in health and pastoral care ministry. And it's not because God wants it. He allows it, and sometimes it's for the greater good, sometimes it's for our own good, and sometimes it's for the good of others. Our job is to get alongside people, to listen, to be attentive to their needs, to discern what's required, and prayerfully bring those needs before God. Don't apologize for God when people are really struggling, and don't give platitudes like God doesn't give you any more than you can take. That is a verse that can be used meaningfully to bring encouragement, but it can also bring such incredible hurt, because at that time the person doesn't feel that they are able to cope and able to bear this suffering. And so our role is to encourage and to not bring words from God that are hurtful, but to bring words that are hopeful. Our presence is most important, and we can be present in silence. We don't even have to have words when people are seriously suffering. Sometimes that presence is all that is required. So there are some principles for caring, and I love this quote from Oswald Chambers, and I think it's one that we should all remember. God never gives us discernment so we can criticize, but so we can intercede. If we see that there are things wrong in a person's life, and that some of these crises are self-made or made by interpersonal relationships that need work, our job is to discern and pray, not to discern and criticize. So ask God for the correct words and the correct actions at this time of crisis. Aim to listen and advise, listen and understand, not advise, because what the person really needs is someone to hear their story, hear their situation, and often in the telling of that story to you, they will hear their own voice and come up with their own solutions to their own struggles. Our job is to listen carefully, lovingly, and encouragingly. In times of crisis, it's always important to look at your own motives to see why you're so involved in the situation. Having worked in an emergency department, I've seen more than my fair share of crises over the decade or more that I work there. And oftentimes, people's motive was more nosiness and almost a form of voyeurism to know what was going on rather than to actually journey with someone through the struggle to help them to find their solutions. So be sure that your motives are godly and that you are dependable but not dependent, so that you're not taking over the situation for the person, that you're enabling them. Sometimes that first phone call that people make up in a time of crisis is the catalyst for thinking, I can cope. If everything is done for people, they start to feel like they can't cope and they will never cope. And so you really need to enable and empower and patiently journey with people, encouraging them to take one small step at a time. And with each small step, the coping grows, because coping is like a muscle. The more you use it, the more skills you have, the stronger you become in your coping mechanisms and the more resilient you are. At the end of the crisis, you've developed stronger capacity to bounce back in future crises. Be a servant, be willing to be there. It can take a long time to journey with people through from that crisis episode to a point where you can step out and they are strong again. Always be encouraging, be patient, be sensitive, be willing to go deeper with people so that the conversation doesn't stay at the really peripheral surface level. Be willing to ask them how their relationship is with God in this struggle, and be prepared to hear that they're not very happy with God sometimes. In fact, they don't even know where God is at times. And so be prepared for anger, be prepared for frustration, be prepared for the answers that people question. They question their faith, they question the goodness of God, and you need to be prepared to be caring and sensitive about that, and prayerful and discerning in your responses. I'll give you a case study for you to think about as a concluding point, because Ella is a 34-year-old mother of a 3-month-old baby. She is married to Tim. Ella has been struggling with depression after the birth of her baby. On the weekend, Ella became so desperate she took the baby to her mother's home, saying she couldn't take care of him anymore. Her mother rang a pastoral care team, greatly concerned about the situation. Consider how your team can provide effective pastoral care that has a health focus for this situation. There are many players in the situation, and you as a pastoral care person need to go in sensitively, carefully, prayerfully, and discern how you can support Ella, her husband Tim, her mother, and her baby. God bless you as you work together through crisis. It can be a time of great struggle, but it can also be a time of great growth.